Welcome back to the course. Today we're going to be discussing The Chimney Sweeper by William Blake in the Songs of Innocence and Experience, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. Today I'm going to be arguing that this is one of the most complex pieces in the Songs of Innocence, perhaps in the Songs of Innocence and Experience. And what I want to do today is peel back a few things that we'll explore more later. I also have a video that I did several years ago where I did a long discussion about the history of chimney sweepers, about the era and things like that, which I'll get into a little bit today. But if you want an even more in-depth discussion, you can refer to that, and I'll have a link for that as well. So my argument along this whole course is that William Blake is the best introduction to poetry because it is easily accessible language that a 3-year-old can appreciate, just the sounds itself, that it can be explored throughout a lifetime. This book will take you maybe 30 minutes to read it in just the reading of the words, but you can literally spend a lifetime contemplating, thinking about it, exploring, what it means. So my process is to read it, and this is for all poetry, to read the poem, to read it aloud, and to reread it. Then it is to converse with verse. That is just going back and forth out loud with the text to the best of your abilities. When I do that today, I'm going to try to remove a lot of my knowledge of the background. This is a poem that really reveals the idea that the more knowledge you have in your mind about the subject, the idea being expressed, the more the power that the poem has, the more it will resonate, the more emotional impact it will have. So if you don't have a lot of knowledge about this world, chimney sweepers in the 1800s or 18th century, you're going to still get something out of it. The more knowledge you have, the more imagery you have, the more understanding, the more powerful it will be. Okay, so here we go. The Chimney Sweeper from Songs of Innocence by William Blake. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me, while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved. So I said, hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. And so he was quiet, and that very night, as Tom was a-sleeping, he had such a sight, that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. And by came an angel, who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down came a green plane, leaping, laughing, they run, and wash in a river and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark, and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. Okay, so again, my goal is to do a converse with verse. I'm going to try to remove as much of my knowledge of this as possible at the beginning. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of knowledge, and then we're going to go back to it a little bit. So here we have a story poem. So this is clearly a young boy telling a story. Who he's telling the story to, you can think about that later. But he says at the beginning, when my mother died, so his mother died as he was young, and his father sold him, while yet his tongue, so when he was too young to speak properly, all he could do is cry, weep, 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 which obviously has, to my ear, the sound of a little baby bird, right? So it's this little tiny fragile baby bird, weep, 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 weep. And there's an association I have in listening to this poem with this child, about this child. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. So that's who's telling the story, is a chimney sweeper. Now the chimney sweeper talks about little Tom Dacker. There's little Tom Dacker, who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved. So he had this curly white hair. It was a blonde boy, and they shaved it. Now the narrator says, "Hush, Tom, never mind it. For when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair." So he has head like mine now. And, if you're listening to this, I have a shaved head. And, now he doesn't have to worry about his hair getting spoiled, right? So, okay, so it's the narrator's putting it in a positive spin. Now, I do notice, especially having read several of the other poems, the lamb reference. So there's clearly, this is in the Songs of Innocence, there's clearly a relationship between the Lamb of Innocence, Jesus. There's all this correlation happening here. And now the story that the narrator tells to Tom works a little bit. And so he was quiet, and that very night, as Tom was asleeping, he had such a sight. So this story that was told was to calm him from crying. So Tom is crying in the night. And then he has a dream that night, Tom, that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. Okay, so they're in these coffins. I imagine that's got to be the chimneys, right? It's kind of an analogy and metaphor here. But by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain, leaping, laughing, they run. So they are now playing as children do, and wash in a river and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom, this is still in the dream, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. So we have a story of a young boy who was sold off to be a chimney sweeper. His friend Tom Dacker is crying. In order to alleviate his crying, the narrator hushes him and reminds him of the goodness of why his head was shaved. The boy has a dream, a premonition, a narrative that goes in his mind about them all being freed by an angel. And then they get to play in the meadows. And then Tom wakes, he gets to work, and he's happy and warm now. So he's kept warm by this story. So on the surface, there is this just young boy being consoled in his sadness of, what's happening in his life. Underneath this is a deep reform that led to massive amounts of changes in England and the world. This was a very powerful poem that really resonated with a lot of people at the time, and there's a really important reason for this. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of knowledge about chimney sweepers. I think the only image, if we have any image at all, of chimney sweepers is probably from Mary Poppins, and it's Dick Van Dyke. It was happy-go-lucky, playful, dancing and singing, and there's, things going on about his, about what's really going on, but it's really, I think, comes across as like a playful, fun, experience of this chimney sweeper. The reality of chimney sweepers was quite horrific, actually. So the chimney sweepers, actually, let me show you this first image. So chimneys in England and throughout a lot of Europe and Italy and many other places, from the 1200s onward, as the housing structures and buildings got more and more complex, sometimes they're shared flues, there would be these intermingling, and this is not even the scariest example. There are a series of almost mazes of these flues going throughout, these tenement buildings and these buildings throughout England that were connected, and they could be very confusing. Here's just a simple graph this is 1834, that was showing, when there was starting to be new methods of being able to clean chimneys. And so I wanted to show you that. So what would happen though is you had all these chimneys, they needed to be swept, because if they didn't get swept it could lead to fires and disasters. So, because it would accumulate too much soot and then it would catch on fire, it would block the flames, things would happen, that would be bad. It's really important to sweep them. So it saved lives to sweep them. But in order to do it, this man on the left, in this case, is the master apprentice. And the little boy is the one who actually goes down into the flue because of his size. So they had to use children. And there's writings about this, about how the best child. So the best child was somewhere around like 4 years old and a smaller diminutive child. So you needed a child that had the power to propel themselves through these flues, but was small enough to do it. So there was a real ideal match. Now, most of these children were orphans. That's referred to in the poem. And that was a reality, is that it was orphans, or, a mother died or the parents, just both of them, sold the child. That was actually a regular practice, into indentured servitude to these master chimney sweepers. Now, I know everybody might think the master chimney sweepers are evil, but one practice that people don't realize is he was probably a child chimney sweeper. So he's just kind of part of the system, and he doesn't know any better. It's just he did it when he was a kid, and now it's his turn to do it for, kids have to do it the next time. Here's another image of a master and child chimney sweeper. This one's from Italy. Now I want to show in the flue, this is a good image I found online of what could happen. So as the child was propelling himself and cleaning, this on the left is a good image of what happens. Sometimes a child might accidentally get into this kind of position and get stuck and die. I want you to sit with that for a second. So a child could get stuck in this position and die. Here is a popular image from the 1800s, I believe it was, of an occurrence that occurred but was not irregular. It did happen. It happened somewhat regularly. Not all the time. It wasn't like 100% of the time, but it happened regularly, where a child would get lost in the flue system that was complicated, couldn't find their way out, and eventually suffocated and died. And they would try to get the child out by smashing through the door or through the wall to get them out. Obviously, this is a traumatic experience for everybody involved. Here you have a young dead child on the floor. You have a young child being pulled out. This was an incident that actually occurred, that was in the news in England at the time, and they illustrated it through this image. In fact, a lot of these kids would end up having very short lives. They would get testicular cancers. They would get, things happening to their genitals, because they would also often go nearly naked or naked completely, because it allowed for them to be less likely to get stuck on something. So my goal is to show this to you in order to just give you some of the knowledge of what's happening in the background of this poem that the people of England are starting to become more and more aware of. I mean, everybody in England would know, especially, everybody in London, for instance, would know about chimney sweepers, because they would be on the corners crying, sweep, 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 for, if you need a sweeping. That's what we get a little bit here with the weep, weep, is a relationship to that. That sound would be a regular sound that Londoners would hear at the time. And I think it's really important to know that in order to read this poem. So my point of all this was to showcase to you that if you read it without any of this knowledge, you still get a sense, I think, of the sadness, that there's something tragic going on here. When you add knowledge to it, which as a teacher you should be doing with your students, right? Or just as a reader of poetry and literature, when you add knowledge to it, there's so much more that starts to become clear. And one of the things that becomes clear, I think, is that this is not simply a poem about, some random story about a chimney sweeper, that there's layers of things going on. So one thing to know about Blake is he was also a reformer. He was friends with Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women. He was related to, or not related. He knew and interacted in the same circles as Thomas Paine, and he's really talking about, in other poems, we talked about the little black boy, about slavery in the West. He kind of refers to that, but he's not talking about it in the sense of, how a lawyer might talk about it. He's an artist. He's a poet. So he's giving you different methodologies to approach this issue. Here, as a reformer, he's trying to make you, I think, empathize, to get in the skin of these little children. And I think there's a multi-layered thing that'll come up clearer as we go through the entirety of the story. But I want you to, knowing what you now know about how horrific it is, that these children who were, in a sense, necessary, right? So this is the complicated thing, is not that people could die from suffocation from fire without chimney sweeps. And there was a period of time when the main methodology for doing this, before it was more mechanized, was using children. And if you just, again, think about walking through London and seeing a child after reading this poem, seeing a child on the side of the streets, yelling with their chimney sweeper, their broom, saying, "Sweep, sweep, sweep, sweep." And you heard that. I want you to kind of have that in your mind as I read this one more time. "When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, 'Weep, weep, weep, weep.' So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacre, who cried when his head, that curled like a lamb's back, was shaved. So I said, 'Hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair.' And so he was quiet, and that very night, as Tom was a-sleepin', he had such a sight, that thousands of sweepers, Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, were all of them locked up in coffins of black. And by came an angel who had a bright key, and he opened the coffins and set them all free. Then down a green plain, leaping, laughing they run, and wash in a river, and shine in the sun. Then naked and white, all their bags left behind, they rise upon clouds and sport in the wind. And the angel told Tom, if he'd be a good boy, he'd have God for his father and never want joy. And so Tom awoke, and we rose in the dark, and got with our bags and our brushes to work. Though the morning was cold, Tom was happy and warm. So if all do their duty, they need not fear harm." So this is something that's a theme that's going to come out more and more in this course. That what is happening here is you get the sympathy of, this is in the Songs of Innocence. So this is from the perspective of the little boy and how he's contending with his life, right? So he's trying to deal with and accept the life that he has. And what is it? And we saw this with the little black boy. What specifically is it that triggers him and Tom to feel happy and warm? And if they do their duty, what is it? I'm going to suggest that it's the story that is ingrained in them about this angel saving them. So there's a question, if you're a good Christian in London in this time, what good is that story to Tom, to Dick, Joe, Ned, and Jack, and to the narrator? What is it doing? It's keeping them in this system. I want you to think about that for a minute. So you're a Christian in London in 1789, 1795, and you see a little boy on the side doing this. And then you think of this poem and you think, the stories that I believe in of this angel protecting this child is keeping this child there. And I just want you to think about the role of this story in keeping this children happy, in this whole system that they're having. And whether, you think that's a good thing or a bad thing and why that might be, and the imagery here is, again, you have the children kind of playing, and this is the end result of what they will hopefully accomplish. But that's the chimney sweeper. We're going to see another chimney sweeper. So one of the things I hope you stick around for the course is that we will combine this mosaic of ideas together, because we want to, as Blake is doing, want to understand what Blake is talking about when he wants to show the two contrary states of the human soul. What is he getting at with all of this? And only through reading the entirety of it and then coming back to it all can we really grasp that, which is why I think this is the best book to teach in order to get people to, at any age, to understand poetry. And the last thing I'll say about this, even though there's some pretty tricky things, I still think that if you read this to a young child, they're not going to get any of the meaning of this. And it'll just sound pleasant. And what the end result is if they read this again, and let's say they read it at 6 years old, or you read it to them at 5 years old, and then they read it again in 8th grade, with some other maybe stories about London at the time. And then they read it when they're a senior in high school or in college, and they get some of these underlying narratives and they really dig into the Blake and his deeper work, that's something that will sit with them for the rest of their lives and will be something for them that'll open their minds and understanding about the world, about poetry and what it can do. Okay, so that is the Chimney Sweeper. We will be referring back to it in the future. So, I hope you got something out of it, and I hope you will read it for yourself and think about what you think it means.